So Don Quixote comes back from his first sally, his first adventures, beaten up and deposited at home after being found on the side of the road, essentially by a neighbor who very discreetly brings him home. When he is at home, he's exhausted, he's hungry, he's somewhat delirious, you could argue. He finds there his what not his wife, he's not married, his niece and his housekeeper with whom he lives, the niece and the housekeeper. But also two friends, a local priest or a curate, depending on your translation, and the local town barber. These are his friends who come over to check on him and with whom he, considers somewhat peers, I guess. They're around the same age, I get the sense. It's a little vague. It's curious that it is a priest and a barber. Priest being somebody of distinction, the barber being a fairly ordinary tradesman. But curiously, you have these three figures. Quijana is the aristocrat, the priest is the church, and the barber is, let's say, the middle class. And they're all more or less, you get the sense, friends. They're all equals of a sort. So it's an interesting little dynamic there. But he comes home and they're all glad to see him. They haven't known where he is, but he basically just, after discussing a few things deliriously, he just passes out and he sleeps for like a couple of days. And these four people, the priest, the barber, the housekeeper, and the niece, then have a little conversation and they discuss, well, what is the problem here? And pretty soon they seize on the problem being as well books. All he does all day long is read these silly books about knights, and it has so infected his brain that now he thinks he is one. And this is clearly the problem. So the four of them go in what is a very famous scene, somewhat overlooked sometimes, but it's the scene that Cervantes himself calls the Inquisition of the library. Inquisition meaning they go and it's an inquiry into it. See what kind of books are in there. Maybe there's some dangerous ones we should remove. But of course, in early 17th century, late 15th century Spain, Inquisition has another meaning. Inquisition. The books are to blame. They always go after the intellectuals first. They go through the books in Quijana's library, and one by one they take them up, they evaluate them, and they decide whether or not that book should be burned. Book burning has a long and colorful tradition, and I'll leave you to make some associations there. But the staging of this is all very much like the Inquisition, where a subject is brought forward and evaluated, sometimes on very questionable evidence, sometimes on really uncertain standards, somewhat arbitrary judgments, whether or not that subject should be burned or spared. Burning at the stake is a common punishment for the Inquisition. For people, not books. But they go through these books one by one, and it's a really fun little scene. For one thing, it gives you an idea of what he has been reading, and it's a library that is quite full of real books, classics of the knightly genre, the genre of romance and courtesy, Some of them quite well known, others more obscure. Cervantes puts one of his own in there, Galatea, one that had some critics had some carping about a few years back, and you can see he's just sort of tossing in his own. There's a little bit of a knowing wink at all of that, but throughout there, it follows a pattern where they take up a book and they discuss it, and usually it's the housekeeper and the niece who are most adamant that the book be burned. There's an unavoidable gender question there. They are quite firm in their certainty that these books are immoral and they should no longer exist, and we certainly cannot have them around a mind as weak as Senor Quijano. But the other fun dynamic throughout is, as you're going through it all, you get the priest, the avatar of great morality throughout, supposedly, who is defending them. Because he knows all of the books somehow. These are supposedly very immoral books, but the priest knows them all, and in some cases is quite emphatic about it. So while the women and the barber are suggesting this, that, and the other thing, he's the one who actually puts up the greatest defense. They're just sort of taking them up, looking at them. Oh yeah, this one. Blah, 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 blah. They'll discuss it for a half a second and then toss it off, say, into the fire with it. And, you're a little shocked by that sometimes at the speed with which. But you get the priest defending it. Sometimes, remarkably, not just for the obvious thing of, the priest, but sometimes in ways that really push that boundary of gentle satire into really biting criticism. At one point, they take up a book, the history of that famous knight Tirante the White, and the priest shoots back. "God in heaven protect me," shouted the priest. "We're in the presence of Tirante the White. Hand him over, my friend. Why, I've found this story a treasure house of delight, a gold mine of pleasure." A priest, particularly in Spain in this era, is not supposed to be that responsive to pleasure. It's not supposed to be big on his priority list. But the enthusiasm, the passion with which he defends this book, that he jumps in just at the mere mention of it. Oh! He says at one point, "To tell you the truth, my friend, for its style, this is the best book in the world." The best book in the world? A priest says that. Aren't priests supposed to be big fans of another book? Isn't that what they're supposed to hold as, above all else, certainly the best in the world? It's not subtle. It is really extraordinarily biting and broad at times satire. But it's wonderful in the way that Cervantes sets up this little scene where, Quixote isn't even really there for most of it. He comes in a little at the end, but it's just this little set piece where he gathers these characters with whom we really have no association. We really haven't met them before, and he has this little scene which can easily not be part of the novel itself, the book itself, the story of Don Quixote. These are all very minor characters who are suddenly just, on the periphery of his story, and they're having this very significant scene. But he includes it in here because, A, it's very funny, to see like the priest reacting that way. And the 19-year-old niece has some of the most firm opinions, as young adults tend to. And you get that character dynamic around, and it's all just gratuitous, but it's also rich. And yes, he's probably leaving it in there because it does make such great social commentary. But I think it's really more just to show the complexity and the diversity of opinions around there. And let's not forget, throughout the prologue, his big project that he himself supposedly is stating for this book is a criticism of courtly literature, a criticism of these stories. And here's an opportunity for him to really go into that. And he does to a certain degree, but at the same time, he has the voice of the priest saying, yeah, but that was good. And you get this rich, polyphonic portrait, to mix metaphors. You get all of these different opinions, all of these different perspectives weaving together, and you're never quite sure whose side to take, although you're probably not on the book burning side. It's wonderful in its own small way. And they come up with a plan at the end of this when they burn a number of books, toss them out the window, and all right, we're going to burn that one, burn that one, burn that one. And at the end, they decide that, well, that's not quite enough. They're going to wall up the library itself. They're just going to encase the entire room and anything that's still in it. And they're going to do it in such a way that he will not be able to ever find it. He won't realize it. Or at least that it'll be an argument around it. They'll wall over the doors. Presumably this is a fairly large house. He's a fairly wealthy man. And, you know, many rooms in it. If you wall up one room in a small apartment, you notice. If you wall up one room in a 20-room mansion, it's a little bit more obscure. But they decide they cover over the doors, they just make it disappear. And then they come up with a story that is funny, because they say, you know, they could say that a magician had carried them off, room and all. A magician came, stole the books and the entire room, and swept off, which is a preposterous little plot, exactly like the kind of stuff that you would find in all the books that they had just been criticizing. So they're kind of implicated in that same hypocrisy. The Quixote stumbles in. He's been asleep for like 2 days at this point, and he can't find the library, and he's upset, and they tell him this story, and he believes it, or at least he appears to. They give him the name of a magician, Muniaton the Wise, and he says, oh, he must have said Freston, and this is a callback to one of the titles that he read earlier. So he's blending the imaginary world of books that he's been dwelling in so much with his own reality now, just as much as he was when he was, you know, out in the world and confusing prostitutes for grand ladies. It's a sad little moment, but it's also, it doesn't stop his delusion. Immediately after that, he goes off on his next journey. So the cure of trying to just wall off or burn any influence of imagination doesn't work. It's ineffective. It's almost beside the point. Remember, they had already tried to move him away from the books, and he just started thinking the things in his mind anyway. He doesn't really need them anymore. You get the sense he's read everything in his library several times over. So it is steeped into his identity in a way that at this point the imaginative world is more his life than the world in that small materialist room that he calls his library. But then he is ready for his next journey, his next sally. And he decides, okay, I went out the first time, I had a few problems, but I think we can all agree it was a great success. He follows some of the instructions that he got from the innkeeper, who gave him some advice. You're going to need some money, you're going to need some clean shirts, let's think about the basics here. Stuff that they just don't go into very often in the books that he's familiar with. The reality of life, money, and laundry. So he attends to that, and he also decides, well, okay, I need a squire. I need an assistant. I need somebody who, can follow along after me and help me when needed and all that. Because remember all those times he was having trouble just getting up. I mean, having somebody there in your corner to come and give you a boost when you don't have the agility anymore to sit up in a suit of armor. This would all be handy. So he sought out a farmer, a neighbor of his, and a good man, if we can use that term for anyone who's poor, in parentheses. A good man, if we can use that term. Little iffy there, little questionable. But this is Sancho Panza. Sancho Panza is one of the great characters and the perfect counterpoint to Quixote. Many critics will tell you that Quixote is the world of romance and fantasy and illusion and poetry. And Sancho Panza is much more the man of realism, of facts, of empirical, I need to see it with my own two eyes, common sense. And I'm not sure about that. I think they're both a little bit more complicated than that. Mainly Sancho, who has some, shades to his personality that are complicated and just as rich. You can't reduce him to simply, stark realism, but that realist tendency allows him some of the great comic moments in here, and thus he makes the story work just a little bit better. You get a sense when Cervantes was writing this, and it is laid out very episodically, as the literature of the courtly love tradition is as well. Very episodic, very simple, unchanging characters going through a succession of adventures that don't necessarily change them as people. He did that in the first the first sally, and the irony of it was relying exclusively on the reader to recognize that, oh, okay, what he's doing now is insane. When you have Sancho there, you can have Sancho running along behind him and saying, "This is insane," and then the reader is sort of shunted off to take a yet different perspective as he tries to pick and choose who should I really be listening to here. It's like, well, Sancho's got a good point, but on the other hand, he's kind of complicated here and there. Maybe he's just out for himself, who knows? And it ups the ante in the dynamic. It makes it more fun to read because there are more different interpretations that you can bring to it. And one of the things that Quixote does is he says, okay, you got to come with me. Sancho Panza he's a farmer. He's got a plate. He's got a job. He has a family. He has a wife, and he has kids. But he just, he gets up and he leaves them. You can make what you will of that. But Quixote promises to make him the governor of an island. It's all a little bit, it's a little shady. It's not exactly like he brings out a written contract or anything, but he tells him, if in the course of our adventures we take possession of or conquer an island, you can be the governor of it. And remember, this is also in the great age of Spanish exploration. The New World is just across the ocean where there are lots of islands, and they all need colonial governors. And so this is a real offer of sorts. This would seem more plausible then than it would perhaps today. And Sancho Panza just takes him at face value for that. Says, well, yeah, I could do that. And he likes styling himself as, you know, a great gentleman, a leader, a commanding figure, because he's just a peasant and a very common man. He is couched in very common terms. The word panza means belly, and he's always eating and drinking, and, you know, he's concerned with these very common, ordinary human qualities that don't really mean so much to Quixote. Quixote really only eats every now and then. More often than not, he abstains, and Panza never passes up a meal. You gotta love him. In Chapter 8, however, they've left, they've teamed up, they've left, they've gone off, and they have their first adventures. And this is one of the greatest scenes in all of in the entire history of civilization. It's a classic. There have been a number of attempts to make movies of this. Some of them, most of them just fail utterly. But I gotta believe that the main impetus for people wanting to make it is the scene with the windmills. It's the classic. If you go to Spain and you land in the airport, you're going to find little trinkets of windmills and little Quixotes on a donkey or whatever charging at them. And it's a cliche in language, you know, to say that you are charging at windmills is something you say when, you know, when you're doing a ridiculous quest, a quest of your imagination, a quest that is ultimately preposterous. They're riding along and they see windmills. Of course, Sancho sees windmills. Quixote sees giants. Giants with big arms. And he says, "Oh, I must fight them." And Sancho's like, "What? Those aren't giants. What are you talking about, sir?" He's such a realist. He doesn't recognize, he doesn't think beyond the surface. And he sees Quixote as just saying something, and he takes it at face value. It's like, oh, okay, he thinks that he sees that. He doesn't think beyond that into, like, well, maybe he's not quite right in the head. Sancho's not the brightest tool in the shed either, but sharpest tool in the shed. But he doesn't really take that next step. So he is utterly bewildered when he says, "But they're not giants, they're windmills." Quixote doesn't care, takes out the lance and spurs Rocinante, and they charge, and they go running full bore straight at the windmills, of course, and a breeze kicks up, and the fans start to move, the great giant arms start to move, and he runs into the windmill, smashes his lance, gets pulled up by the upswing of one of the sails for the windmill, and twisted. Rocinante gets tossed on the side. He gets lifted up in the air and dumped back on the ground, and of course he ends up battered and bruised once again. He charges out, saying, "Flee not, O cowards and dastardly creatures, for he who attacks you is a knight alone and unaccompanied." Well, he's not a loner unaccompanied. He has Panza, but he doesn't count, I guess. But it's hysterical, and Panza's just sitting there like, huh? Huh? I don't get it. And he comes up to Quixote at the end. God help me, cried Sancho. Didn't I tell your grace to be careful with what you did, that these were just windmills, and anyone who could ignore that had to have windmills in his head? Quixote says, silence, Sancho, my friend, answered Don Quixote. Even more than other things, war is subject to perpetual change. So he sees more magic. Just like the library disappeared, he believes it instantly and says, okay, magic. There are evil forces out there that just change things. War is subject to perpetual change. Perpetual change. And that's just an odd little comment that gets sort of like shoehorned in there. What is that? And you just think about change and the nature of it. Change confuses people. Quixote is very confused. Change scares people. Quixote is choosing not to be scared. As his life is changing, as his mind slips away, as the people he knows, perhaps, the longest are dying off, as the society he knows, as industrialization starts creeping in and the rising middle class, and there's a whole new world out there just over the ocean, and it's going to be changing things here, and that's going to have big sweeping economic changes, which is going to displace a lot of the steady interest beforehand. The entire economic model is disrupted. You have new money coming in from the colonies, making the merchant class much wealthier, and the aristocracy, which had controlled all the money beforehand, is slowly going down in wealth. Change. War is subject to perpetual change. He doesn't shirk from it. He charges against it in the only way he knows how. Maybe his imagination is a way of shirking it. Maybe his imagination is a refuge from it. But things still change in his imagination. And he deals with it. And he's never afraid. And he never pities himself. He just decides to deal with it how he can. So you can see that little character blossoming out in these moments. They get up, they dust off, they ride on, and pretty soon they come across another little caravan. This one is a coach with a couple of friars, I think Benedictine friars walking along, and there's a woman in a coach, and there are some attendants around. So it's a substantive collection of people. And of course, Don Quixote sees them and perceives that, this is something else that he has to right, some other wrong that he needs to jump in and correct. He needs to rescue and be the hero. He beats up the Benedictine friars, almost kills them. And you can read that a number of different ways and have at it. One of the attendants, a mule driver, somebody who's just sort of walking along taking care of the mules, is a big Basque, somebody from the Basque region in France, where it's a largely separate culture, separatist culture, to be perfectly honest, and they have their own dialect, their own language, largely. So when his dialogue is transcribed and translated, it comes off as wildly grammatically incorrect in any language. And you can have a lot of fun with that, especially when you read it out loud. Because, some of the first lines he offers, go away, wrong writing knight, By the God that made me, if you no leave coach, as I am Basque, I kill you. And you can see I'm sort of slipping into a little bit of an accent at the end, almost like a Soviet accent. I don't know. Something old-fashioned, supposed to be the heavy. And it's silly, and you can have a lot of fun with that. It is another example of somebody being sort of othered a little bit, you can say, for language. Language is language like a book, like a text, is just one more thing to try and, is just one more incrustation of culture over something within that maybe we have no access to, but it's all we have, so we try and deal with that. So we try and deal with his language, and it's sort of funny. It's amusing. But he's not going to be bullied around in this, and so he takes on this fight. He stands up to Quixote. Now, Quixote has been attacking this entourage here, so this guy, he's really only doing the right thing, you could argue. But they decide that, okay, they're going to have a duel. And the Basque, you get the sense, is a fairly big guy, a much younger man, and he gives a good knock against Quixote. Basque gave Don Quixote a great blow on the shoulder, swinging over his shield, and had our knight not been in armor, the thrust would have split him down to the waist. So, that's quite a good shot. He, feeling the weight of this colossal blow, Don Quixote cried out at the top of his lungs, "O lady of my soul, Dulcinea, flower of my beauty, help this knight of yours who, to please your great goodness, now finds himself in this difficult situation." Once again, in a moment of crisis, he turns to Dulcinea, and he offers what is essentially a little prayer. Help this knight. He's seeking help. This is a prayer, and he is praying to Dulcinea, this woman whom he does not know and has largely conjured out of his mind. He's appealing to an ideal spirit for inspiration, for help, for guidance. What's wrong with that? He finds himself down, knocked down once again, quite literally, and he is trying to get back up, to find the strength. So he appeals to the ideal to help him continue on. So they set up this duel. There came Don Quixote right at the wary Basque, his sword raised high, resolved to cut the man in half, and the Basque awaited him, his sword too lifted high. They're lining up. They've got the swords ready. They're charging at one another. Everyone around was terrified, waiting to find out what would come of the tremendous blows which each of them was threatening for the other. And the lady in the couch and the rest of her servants were saying 1,000 prayers and making their vows to every holy image and sacred shrine in all of Spain, if only God would save their fellow and them too from the immense dangers in which they found themselves. Cliffhanger. That high point, super dramatic. You can feel the tension. Cliffhanger. But the trouble with all that is that at this exact point, at these exact words, the original author of this history left the battle suspended in midair, excusing himself on the grounds that he could not find anything more written on the subject of these exploits of Don Quixote than what had already been set down. At the fever pitch of the plot, lining up these two forces that, everybody loves a good duel. Everybody loves a good fight. A battle is one of the most age-old set pieces in any story. So we're all really in it. And they're baiting us with all these details about, the witnesses and the two guys with holding up the swords, and everybody's saying prayers, and oh my God, they're biting their nails. And at that moment, that's when they not only stop the story, which automatically tells you that, well, okay, this is all kind of artificial. Oh, yes, it's a cliffhanger. But the way they do it, explicitly pointing out that the original author of this history left the battle suspended in midair, pointing out how artificial this whole thing is, that the author Cervantes is basically transcribing this story from another story that he has, another text that he has. So we have a text of something that suddenly broke off because we have no idea what's going on. We have all of these levels in between us and the truth of what happened that we can't really take any of it at face value. And they did it at the moment when we're most invested, when we are most on the edge of our seats, when we have bought into it so much. There's no irony in those moments. There's no objective distance. We're just, yeah, we want to see the fight. We want to see the fight. We want to see the fight. But that's when you're the most vulnerable, because that's when a text can slip things past you. You have to stay forever vigilant when you're reading. You can't just buy into the world that the text is presenting to you. You have to understand that there are levels of interpretation going on, and there's an awful lot happening behind the scenes that the author is relying on keeping invisible from you so that you don't doubt the illusion. Now, it's not hard to see this in the broader context of the Renaissance, the broader context of the doubting of everything that has come before you. This is very late Renaissance. This is where the reliance on established authorities is starting to chip away, where the worship of the authorities of the past is starting to come under some new scrutiny, because the authorities of the past were brought back to critique in the earlier Renaissance, were brought back to critique the current society, the current civilization, and say that, well, look, we're doing things poorly now because we have strayed from the advice of our forefathers. But that had largely run its course. And at this point in history, you can see that tendency to ask questions, to doubt, to remind yourself not to get swept up in the mechanisms of rhetoric built into authority structures. That habit of criticism is starting to turn on itself and say, well, okay, what is being used to sell me on something now? What can I trust? Can I believe anything I read or see or am told? Do I always need to be skeptical? And this little moment just pulls the rug out of that moment when you are at your least skeptical, because you're so there with the emotion of the story that you need to be smacked and told, remember, this is all fake.